Be mindful of Allah. He speaks of all things. He speaks of the women and children. Doesn't leave out anything. Leave out anything. The rights of women, children, and society.
Assalamu alaikum. Sunnahfollowers presents a new class taught by Dr. Ibrahim Jamali. The rights of women and children in Islam, defined by Surah and Nisa. Streaming on all major platforms every Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern, right here on Sunnahfollowers.
Everyone, and as always, I invoke the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, to grant me clarity of thought and speech, and to convey this most mistakes. So my own, you can say, guys here, so to speak. So last week, for those of you who missed, I do recommend that you watch last week's before coming into this one. Now, you can watch this one without seeing last week's. You're just going to kind of miss a lot of the key players and kind of the build up to this. But what we are doing is we are running through from the foundation of the term Zionist all the way to the modern world. And you are going to be able to see the evolution of this Palestinian crisis through a secular lens. As I mentioned last week, we are not looking at this from a religious perspective. Because when you invoke religion, you invoke ego, you invoke culture, tradition, and you typically don't get anywhere. So what we've aimed for here was to use secular law, secular principles, and their own words against them to make the case that we are not in the wrong, that the Palestinians have a right to exist. We showed in part one the slow progression of this agenda through the Balfour Declaration, which is where we left off, where you had simultaneously Zionists being promised a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a land that was still at that time not fully out of the Ottoman hands. We saw deals going on the other side, where these same British authorities were signing a Sykes-Picot agreement and were already taking claim to this land. We saw the Sharif Hussein had made deals with them to fight the Ottomans on their behalf in exchange, basically, for sovereign Arab states. We left off with the Balfour Declaration being signed in November of 1917. And now we're going to pick up today between 1918 and 1947. We are going to see, basically, again, the creation of the League of Nations with something that would be, you could say, a cause, not a cause, but an effect of the First World War. We are going to see the role of the Zionist Commission. We are going to see the beginning of the mandated process, where Palestine became officially mandated under British control. We are going to explore what exactly that means when a nation was mandated, and the eventual, as you can see, the shift away from colonialism into this mandate system. We are going to see how in the 1920s and 30s, immigration became a weapon. And I want everyone to pay attention to the language that was used back then. And you can see how they're using immigration as a weapon currently right now in this country and numerous other countries around the world. The exact same techniques about displacing somebody from their land for more sinister purposes. We are going to look at the rebellions and uprisings that inevitably happened from the people of Palestine as they were seeing false promises. On one hand, they're being told, you're going to have sovereignty, you're going to be respected. But then on the other hand, the Balfour Declaration becomes made public. And they are going to see, wait a minute, you're promising our land to the Zionists in one document, but over here, you're promising us to have sovereignty. And of course, the natural resentment. Also, of course, land deals that were being made and other kinds of factors. We're going to explore what caused these rebellions and uprisings and were they justified. We are going to look at the London Conference and the shift, it appeared at the time, to a sympathetic British ear to the Palestinian cause. We are going to then see the process of the beginning of the end of the mandate, and a new superpower was emerging. World War I, the unprecedented superpower in the world, was Great Britain. By the end of the Second World War, you would have a new kid on the block. The United States would assume that mantle. And we're going to see the role of America as it got involved into this. And then we are going to conclude with the ending of the mandate right before the infamous 1948 declaration. We will start on that in part 3, but we're going to end today with the mandate. So let's begin. So after you had, of course, the fall of the Ottomans in World War I, you had already the Balfour Declaration was, already being circulated, and it was deemed illegal right from day one by numerous legal and international authorities, largely in Great Britain. Many people would issue statements saying how this violates, the essence of basic international rule that you can, on one hand, conquer a land from a people and then hand it over to someone else. So as the Balfour Declaration was becoming more and more public, you were seeing a lot of, negativity coming. And this would be something ultimately that would haunt the British, for the next 20 to 30 years. So you had this obstacle going on, of course, what are you going to do with these Ottoman territories? You had all of the Levant, you had Syria, present-day Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, Palestine, and Iraq. And of course, as we went over in part 1, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was already been in the works. They were already dividing the land before the war ever even had come to its conclusion. So you had President Woodrow Wilson had created what he called 14 points, which outlined a framework for how to handle these territories. The point of self-determination, again, this was the era of shifting away from colonialism. We'll come to that in a minute. So Woodrow Wilson was heavily behind giving these people total power and sovereignty over their own destiny up until a point. They would initially have a management phase where they would be stabilized by the British military or whichever country it had been mandated to. And once they were able to reach that maturity of governance, they would be given the keys. And that was originally, as everyone thought, was going to be the plan. But as I showed already behind the scenes, other things had gone on. So in 1918, at the Paris Peace Conference, you introduced the mandate system for the first time. This conference would go on. It was signed on June 28, 1919, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, which also distributed the German lands that had been conquered in the war as well. Now, you would have on February 14th, something key that year in 1919, you would have the Covenant of the League of Nations. This would finally be adopted on April 28th and implemented in January 19th of 1920. So all the Allied victorious powers had came together to form this League of Nations, which was kind of like a precursor, you can say, to the United Nations. And the point was, again, about managing territories fairly and diplomatically that had been conquered in the war and how to treat with the people, in a justifiable way, because colonialism had left a black mark on the British Empire. Colonialism's history of exploitation, taking advantage of slave labor, making people work for next to nothing, taking away all control of the destiny from the people. So part of this was designed to get us away from that system and into something that was supposed to be fairer and better on the surface. So the League of Nations, designed to respond to the prevailing order, adopted mandate concepts, innovation in the international system, as it would accommodate the demands of the colonial age. So the people who conquered, you could say they would still get some of the spoils of war, so to speak, but you would have a moral obligation to the people who had been conquered. And as I said, it was a transition process of slowly shifting control over to them. So they were trying to get both involved here. And now the key piece of legislation that came after that was what they called Article 22. Now, each nation would be assigned a ranking based on a combined set of factors. The first one was their development, whether it be currently, historically. The other one was their history. How much ties did those people have to that land? And cultural achievement. So you would break down different countries based on A, B, C, and mandated system. This is a Class A mandate, this is a Class B, and so on. Now, Palestine, due to its history, received a Class A mandate. This is international law at the time. International. Class A, meaning they were an advanced civilization. They were a people who were able to control their own destiny. They had a rich history, language, culture, religious institutions, and all those things. So they weren't just treated like, a stereotypical third world, country with a lot of tribes of warring factions. This was treated like a top-notch civilization. So certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and the assistance of the mandatory, until such time they are able to stand alone. This, again, is a quote from that document. So they're able to stand alone. You have the administrative authorities. Everything looks good, right? But again, behind the scenes, what was promised. So you would find Syria and Lebanon, they would not get any special treatment, as well as Iraq. Both of these were governed under full control of France until the mandate would be terminated. This would be achieved in 1943 and 1944, respectively. So you would have Syria and Lebanon would become sovereign in a pretty short period of about 23, 24 years. Only in the case, in fact, of all this legislation that was going on, only in this case did Palestine not get afforded such rights, as they were clearly designated Class A. You clearly had Article 22, which is stipulating the requirements for handing over a society that had been conquered to the people. So that kind of sets the stage where we are at this point in time, internationally approaching the 1920s. Now you have here the Zionist Commission, and we talked a bit about this in part one. We were introduced to a gentleman by the name of Chaim Weizmann, Dr. Weizmann. He was a Zionist representative, one of the members of this commission. Well, in 1919, him and representatives of Zionists from France and Italy would send telegram to British officials who were based in Egypt. The telegram stated the chief goal, of course, was the establishment again. So here's Mr. Weizmann. No, you're not going to get too far ahead here. We heard all that colorful language, but you promised us something and we're expecting payment. Now, they put a couple, three key points, into this. Four. And the first one was, of course, that Palestine would be designated again as a home for the Jewish people. Now, at this time, they were using the term a home, not the home. Even though originally in drafts, we touched on part one, they wanted the home, but they agreed in a compromise that the language would be a home. So that would mean there would be, of course, the diaspora across Europe, America, wherever else in the world. But when you change the language to the home, it becomes a little bit more problematic, and they knew this. So they started calling it a home. And one of their provisions was to establish good relations with the Arabs and to create a link between the commission and military forces and the Jewish people and their interests. So 2 points: they wanted good relationship with the Arabs, and they wanted, of course, the military forces and assistance of the British. Military Governor Colonel Robert Storrs would state that the commission was lacking any authority. Like, who are you people? The Balfour Declaration has no authority. He said the Muslim populations of Arabs were not going to be thrilled with the actuality of a Christian country handing over its land to a foreign people. So you see again here inside the British government, there's going to be we'll see this throughout this presentation, a lot of pushback against this. A lot of people, their hearts, their conscience was kicking in. No, this is not good. The Arab people are not going to be, as Mr. Weizmann said, going to have great relations. They're not going to like the idea that all of a sudden that land that was yours for, 1,200, 1,300, some cases longer, is now all of a sudden going to belong to those people. Was not something that was going to go over too well. Lord Curzon would state, and I quote, "As for Weizmann in Palestine, I entertain no doubt that he is out for a Jewish government, if not this moment, but in the near future." So Lord Curzon saw right through this, as well. High-level members of the British government knew exactly what was going on, that they're wanting a Jewish government. Now, in the future, this is going to happen. And again, here you have another quote from Mr. Curzon. He said, "What all this can mean, except government, I do not see. Indeed, a commonwealth, as defined in my dictionary, is a body politic, a state, an independent community, a republic. I feel tolerably sure, therefore, that while Weizmann may say one thing to you, or while you may mean one thing by a national home, he is out for something quite different. He contemplates a Jewish state, a Jewish nation, a subordinate key population of Arabs ruled by Jews, the Jews' possession of the fat of the land, and directing the administration." So again, Lord Curzon knew exactly, like a lot of people did at this time, the Arabs especially, as they started getting wind of this, they knew exactly what was going on. The language in this is saying one thing, but then again, as we've talked about several times already, the language over here is saying something quite differently. He concluded by saying, "I do not envy those who wield the ladder," referring to the Arabs, "when they realize the pressure in which they are certain to be exposed." I mean, the Arabs had no idea at the time what was being mounted against them. The amount of money, the resources, the political backing, they just had no idea at all what was coming. They had no chance. They stood no shot, as we're going to see that as we move on. In the Paris Peace Conference, Wiseman would state the Zionist organization respectfully submits the following draft resolutions for the consideration. The high contracting parties recognize the historic title of Jewish people to Palestine and the right of Jews to reconstitute Palestine as their national home. So now you're seeing it again. Remember, a home before, 1 year later, it's their home. And you're automatically seeing that this is starting to change. The sovereign possession of Palestine shall be vested in the League of Nations, and the government entrusted to Great Britain as mandatory. We talked about the mandate system. It will be subject to the following conditions. Palestine shall be placed under political, administrative, and economic conditions that will ensure the establishment there of a Jewish national home and ultimately render possible the creation of an autonomous commonwealth. Again, calling for a Jewish state. It's all there. President Woodrow Wilson, however, again would object, saying there's no provision here protecting the consent of the governed, and requested international community to come in, do a commission, and evaluate this. So this is, again, not fair. You're talking about having your own autonomous state, but there are people living on the land that your state is there. So at the time, the United States was not what we would see it become, where we're going to see that later in this presentation as things completely shifted with a 25-year period. But at the time, you're seeing there is some disagreements here. So Woodrow Wilson called the King Crane Commission. They would be created. Their chief aim was to, quote, serious modifications to the extreme program of the Zionists, consisting of unlimited migration with the aims to make the area a complete Jewish state. So the King Crane Commission was put together to combat this. This was a problem. Everybody who read the document saw it. Everybody who read between the lines saw it. The program would also state that the program was so extreme that it did not foresee coming to fruition without at least 50,000 soldiers and massive bloodshed. So they put out in this report that you are not even going to be able to implement any of this unless you supply 50,000 strong troops, armor, battalions, everything. Infrastructure has to be in place to basically deal with a rebellion that was evidently going to come from the Arabs. So they're warning here. And then he puts in here something, key. He said all this massive bloodshed for a claim of 2,000-year-old land. And he's highlighting the fact that these people have not been in this land actively, these Zionists in Europe, for 2,000 years. It's like equivalent right now of us going back to a country that was in what they were in the 1 AD and saying that land, that's my ancestral homeland. I mean, it's just beyond absurd when you really strip it down and you look at it, how preposterous, this whole thing is. And this commission, of course, their pleas, their advice would fall on deaf ears. America would never join the League of Nations, and Britain would proceed with everything according to plan, even though they had objections I highlighted earlier within their own government. So now you have the phase of the mandate system coming into fruition. We talked about what that even involves, still conflicts the Zionist plans. Dr. Weissman stated the efforts of the Zionists must be international. This is key. This is foreshadowing. What he's saying right here is that think about this in 10 years or 15 years later. He's wanting this issue to be an international one. He wanted three things: to consolidate support from Jews back to Zionist policies, to harmonize European powers, and obtain total international approval. There would be a mysterious Austrian painter who would rise to become the most famous man of the 20th century. All too convenient, and that's a different topic for a different day, but you can see it right here. They're calling their shots. They're telling you exactly what they need to happen and what they're going to make happen. They need to galvanize Jews. Jews are not wanting to go here. Jews were happy, a lot of them living in the Soviet Union at the time. They were happy living in the European territories. They had businesses, they had families, they had famous places they like to go to. It's like all of us, we become attached to the community in which we live. It was the same thing. They weren't immigrating to Israel in the numbers that he was hoping. They needed to galvanize that. And of course, all too conveniently, we will see later how that happened. Getting international and European powers behind it, World War II, and that mysterious Austrian painter who rose to prominence faster than any man in history and became the most famous man of the 20th century, obviously would have a lot to do with that. Again, foreshadowing. So the decision allowed the Allied powers to support the aims of Zionists, violating Article 22. They would continue to move forward. Citizens of Nazareth, the British administration in Jerusalem, they had a statement. In view of the declaration of the decision of the peace conference regarding the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, we hereby beg and declare that we are the owners of this country and the land is our national home. So you see, again, please, trying things diplomatically, trying to, how can you do this? The disbelief, the shock that must have gone through these people who had spent, again, thousands of years, their grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers had worked the land and had lived there, and now they're being told it belongs to someone else. And the mandate, of course, would go through according to plan. Curzon would come back again, and he was a big proponent of Palestine earlier. He would state, I want the Arabs to have a chance. I don't want a Hebrew state. I do not know what's promised to the Zionists. What undertakings has it been based on? I think the entire concept is wrong. So again, he's saying, I just want these people to have a chance. The House of Lords would oppose this. They were against the Balfour Declaration. They tried to strike it down internally, but after that, it was repealed by the House of Commons, and of course, it went nowhere. So again, important clause that was mentioned, a lot of this is legal, but we have to understand this to understand where we're going to be going later of what happens is, we basically would go through as a national home for the Jewish people, be clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil rights, religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities covering Muslims and Christians. This is very key again here. This is another provision in the mandate clause. Nothing that goes on can violate the religious and civil rights of these people. I'm going to ask you in about 5 to 10 minutes, based on, just simple racism, if you think any of these violated the civil rights of some of the things that were being done by the Zionists almost from day one to the Arab people. Britain would be responsible ultimately in this mandate for placing the country under the political administration and economic conditions to secure the national home. So again, one clause, you got this, then you immediately come up with that. And they also advise an appropriate Zionist committee would be there to establish and cooperate and assist in these matters. So you have a lot of problems, obviously going on. And you had, again, the administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate unlimited Jewish immigration in cooperation with the Jewish agencies under Article 4. So again, we're seeing the beginning of the immigration system. So again, you going through all this, were the Palestinians consulted? They had a Zionist commission. Where was the Arab commission? Where was the Muslim commission? Where was the Christian commission? Nothing consulting the people, violating Article 22, again, of the League of Nations Declaration. Arabs and other international law experts, again, would argue the legality of this all throughout the early periods of time, all falling on deaf ears, citing Article 22 did not matter. The British government then would finally have to come out, and they further elaborated this on July 1st, 1922, with a Churchill memorandum. Years later, Churchill would claim the purpose of this white paper was to make clear the aims and goals of creating self-governing institutions that must be subordinate to the pledge of a Jewish homeland. Winston Churchill, not to get into that, is one of the worst human beings of the last 120 years. We're going to hear his name be mentioned many times later as well. He was a Zionist through and through. He plunged the British into World War II, costing tens of millions of lives. I mean, just one of these wretched human beings, but that's another topic for another time. And of course, the Palestinian people would outright reject his plan. They outright rejected, all of it because they saw clearly that their civil rights and religious rights and domestic rights were being violated. They would have official statement. We wish to point out here that the Jewish population of Palestine, who lived there before the war, never had any trouble with their Arab neighbors. None. They enjoyed the same rights and privileges as their fellow Ottoman citizens. There was never any agitations against them. And this again kind of sums it up, does it? Because we always hear in history how wicked the Muslims were. When the Muslims ruled over people, they tortured them and all these things. But you're seeing clearly here, Jewish people who lived in this land never faced any problems. They lived in peace and harmony. It wasn't until this started going on that you had issues. So now as we conclude the mandate section, everything is now falling into place. They've got their orders, they got the provisions, despite clauses in there. They're going to not mind breaking their own rules. Of course, we saw the detractors. Now they moved on to the next phase, which I call immigration being used as a weapon. Over the next 10 years, we would see an unprecedented rise in the population of Jews. Over 100,000 would immigrate from all over Europe, mainly from the Soviet Union, Soviet states. It would raise the Jewish population in the area from 10% to 17%. And not only with that, but you also had untold amounts of money and resources which were obtained through all these Zionist organizations that existed in the West. These were prominent people, lots of influence, lots of money and capital. They were helping out, much like you're seeing today. When you see people all the way from South America, supposedly they walked all the way to America. Then you find out, of course, it was Zionist organizations that are flooding the United States borders. It's the exact same thing they were doing back then. They were using their agency to facilitate massive migrations. And as we're going to see later, they don't have a problem starting wars to achieve this aim, either. So in 1920, the Jews actually owned, before the beginning of this dark 10 years, they owned 2.5% of the total land. By the end of the decade, it would double. It would be over 5%, so actually more than doubles. And then you would have the beginning of, I talked about the civil rights portion. You would see openly racist policies that would be implemented. As an example, only Jews were allowed to own land. Once the land was in the hand of a Jew, it could never by law be sold to a non-Jew. So once it was in the family, it was always in the family. Jews would make boycotts against Arab labor, where they refused to hire Arabs to work on the land. So you're again taking employment opportunities, discriminating against in the marketplace, which again goes against the very nature of this mandate. Out of the total land that was able to be cultivated, this is even more alarming, 1/6 went into Zionist hands. So you have 17% of the population in 1930, and you have them owning 1/6 of the farmable land. So this is going to be a problem when you've got basically 83% of the population is needing to be fed as well, but then you've got 17% of it is controlling basically 1/6 of the land. This number is only obviously going to get larger. So all this stuff was going on, and again, the red flags, and this is becoming Britain's annual headache. They're constantly seeing what is going on here. Honest members in the government were appalled. You had the Shaw Commission would later investigate these claims and prepare a report. They would state that these behaviors violated, again, the mandate, which it did, and they would post a report that would state the effect of Zionist colonization policies on the Arab. That would be the head. Actually, the result of the purchase of land in Palestine by the Jewish National Fund has been that the land has been extraterritorialized. It's basically and ceases to be land from which the Arab can gain any advantage either now or any time in the future. Not only can he never hope to lease or to cultivate it, but by the stringent provisions of the lease of the Jewish National Fund, he is deprived forever from employment on that land, nor can anyone help him by purchasing the land and restoring it to its common use. So the Jews could just literally take cultivable land and not even do anything with it. And the land would just simply go to waste. They could, in fact, use food as a weapon. And he goes on again just to cite, the different hardships and things that are going on. And, how this, again, goes against the very nature of the treaty. But he's highlighting exactly what is going on. It's gone forever. It can never return. And this would lead later to what they call the Passfield paper, named after Colonel Secretary Lord Passfield. The paper was a plea for fairness. Again, the British, okay, we know you made this agreement. Let's just at least be a little bit equitable here. Let's at least try to be, somewhat fair, because these policies are just simply unreasonable. It would later be negated again by our good friend, Dr. Weitzman, who pops back up, who would state that the goals of the Zionists were more important than equitable treatment. What they tell you 1 year before is not the same as what they're going to tell you now. And we heard a year before when Weitzman was giving his statements, he's looking all nice and he's saying, don't worry, guys, don't worry. The Arab is our number one priority. Right now, he's saying, yeah, there's racist policies. So what? It's too late now. And the goal of the Jewish state's number one. So you're again seeing, again, when these people, what they're telling you in 1920 is not going to be the same as 1921. It may not be the same they're telling you in January, they're telling you in April, or March, maybe even a week, later. It's all about just buying time and for them to continue to raise funds and get the infrastructure in place. Now, as we got into the 1930s, immigration as a weapon concept was slowing down. They had 100,000 come in the 10 years from 1920 to 1930. But what you're seeing, now is what I mentioned. A lot of Jews they're not coming. They were happy. There was no need to come. They felt happy where they were. But again, that key movement in Europe by the Austrian painter would change all that. 232,000, more than doubling what came in the 10 years prior, would come in the 1930 to 1939, raising the Jewish population to 30% of the total population. Their control of land would more than double. They went from 1/6 basically to having over 2/6, almost half within the next 10 years. So you're just seeing the steps here. And the immigration weapon was in full. And we're going to see as we get to a later section how this was one of the provisions the British were really fighting to stop, because they saw, again, what was going on. I mean, now all of a sudden they're 30% of the population. They're just getting the land piece by piece by piece. But the Arabs did rebel. And this is, again, when we hear the term terrorism, we hear it interchangeably with Palestinian. I've heard it all my life. Oh, if the Palestinians just wouldn't stop fighting. All they want to do is fight. They're just terrorists. And they make it seem like a terrorist is someone who smiles and he says, I just want to hurt people today. They never understand that when you've been going through this, and this, and you're begging and you're pleading and you're saying, somebody please help us, and you're watching your land just be taken away, you're watching your rights be taken away, what choice do you have? You've exhausted. And you can see from the Palestinians from the beginning, they went and sent delegations to Europe. They had spokesmen. We're going to see later they're going to send an Arab delegation. All these pleas fell on deaf ears. So what are you expecting the people to do? Honestly, and we're going to see, of course, how terrorism works both ways as well. In 1921, we did have a riot. 95 would die, small skirmish that went on. Formal inquiries would be conducted to determine the causes of these riots, which happened in Jaffa. And of course, this began with demonstrations. So there was a big protest with Bolshevik Jews. Bolshevik Jews are Jews that came from the Eastern Bloc countries. Largely, they were responsible for the Bolshevik takeover of Russia and the murders of 10 million people. Well, now they were here. Along with the Jewish Labor Party, they were doing demonstrations. Arabs came out to confront them. A lot of unpleasantries were exchanged, so to speak. And of course, you had some conflict. But in 8 more years after that, peace, really nothing. Despite all these things, we don't see the Arab population really doing anything. But in 1929, they had enough. You would see violence break out again over a dispute at the Wailing Wall. This would lead to 220 dead. Remember the provision about civil and religious rights, again, being denied later on to people. You can see that in this particular incident. 220 would be dead in this attack. 520 would be injured. And British reinforcements would now have to come in for the first time to restore the peace and bring order. Sir Walter Shaw would be back again, trying again for something. And he was pointing out in reports, 80 years, we never heard anything about this. The Arab people never did this. They never attacked, the minority populations. What is going on down here? Why all of a sudden are we seeing it now? And of course, Shaw had pointed out earlier the reasons why. So again, trying to really get people to come to their senses here. In 1933, there would be full-scale riots for the first time. Due to massive upticks in 1933 as the foundation of Nazi Germany, as I've talked about jokingly several times. This was the springboard. They flipped the switch and they made the environment politically, as it appeared, to be unsettling for Jews. So they would eventually, of course, migrate. The Arabs were seeing the numbers just going up even more. So now you had full-scale riots that were taking place across the country. Another investigation, of course, would go in, and it was again determined basically that what they were finding was the sentiment of the Arabs was, we don't have anyone on our back. When they saw the British, they saw the Zionists. They said, you're just simply here to help these guys. When they were looking at the British soldiers and dignitaries. Who's here for us? And again, that's what the main finding of the Peel report would conclude, was that there was not a balance here between how they were being governed, that the Britain was violating this mandate and all the intent and heart of the mandate system by directly favoring a people. And this was kind of the sentiment, obviously justifiably so, by the Arabs. So you would have, again, 1936 would see massive resistance to foreign rule, prompted by the British government ruling in favor of more permits to Zionist settlers. So again, World War II is about to get underway. You have the anti-Jewish sentiments. So here again, the British, as they promised they wouldn't do, they're issuing more permits for more immigration. And this all goes back to Weizmann's point, which I told you we would come to several times during this, which is, they wanted to get that international unity of Jews, European nations, all to support this and just open up the floodgates. So the Palestinians would, respond by sabotaging roads, railways, pipelines. Curfews would have to be imposed. And of course, the British troops, again, would have to be called in, extra reinforcements. This time we have 275 dead and 1,112 wounded. So by 1938, we have a total casualty number of 3,717, according to British statistics. British troops would have to now be increased to try to maintain control of this, and they increased British troop presence to 18 to 20,000. And additional British police, also about 2,500, would be 2,900 would be brought in to make sure that peace was being maintained. And you started seeing murders and sniping going on around, attacking the British police. Was it Muslims? We shall see. Because, of course, the official narrative obviously always is, Muslims. We're going to see later on what exactly was going on with those attacks, because there's one more barrier. They have World War II coming. They know what they're going to do. They planned it ahead. They got the immigration. They're going to get the international community. They're going to get the funding from Germany still to this day. One obstacle, the British. We've got to get the British out of there, because the British, even though they favored the Zionists, it wasn't taking the handcuffs off. They wanted the handcuffs off, and they were going to have to get rid of the British, obviously, to do it. So it's clear at this point the people of Palestine were not pushovers, as we still see this today. Our brave brothers and sisters over there, these are people. These are hardened individuals, and they never backed down. They never accepted this is the way. We have to accept it. They fought. The British Royal Commission would now be formed and would start to investigate the problem with aims of determining an equitable solution. So we see some action now coming of the British after these wide-scale riots and terrorist attacks. It was determined the situation was irreconcilable. The differences on the two sides were just too far apart. There was just simply no way they were going to be able to bridge this. So the overall goal was what they called a partition system, where they were going to talk about actually having two separate states with their own governments going side by side. That was what was being discussed at the time. Ironically, that's being still discussed to this day. The Palestinians rejected this white paper, asserting that they wanted rights of full independence as they were promised in the League of Nations. The mandate promised them that. It was there. They were not going to give in. Dr. Weizmann, back again, urged acceptance of the plan. At this moment in time, the immigration numbers were not high enough for him to do what he needed. He needed more time. He needed World War II to kick in. You'll see again, what they tell you today is not the same thing they're telling you tomorrow. So initially, he's for this plan. The Jewish state would be promised in this plan a quarter of the northern quarter, and a major part of the western coastal area, 1/3 of the total area, to reflect what they were going to be at the end of the 1930s, 1/3 of the population. So this is a real development that we have seen here. Lots of rioting, lots of fighting, irreconcilable difference. So you have the London Conference, February to March of 1938. This is where we really start to escalate. There would be two separate parallel meetings would take place. One would be the Zionist, the other would be Arab delegations from Egypt, Saudi, Iraq, Transjordan, and Yemen. The two sides refused to be in the same room together, so they did these two kind of parallel, meetings. And the British government would make public the correspondence of Hussein and McMahon. We talked about that in part 1. This is where the promise was made. Hussein revealed this. It's made to the public. There was a promise made. You back us against the Ottomans, we are going to give you the Arabs authority over their territories at the end of the war. So after this, in May of 1930, the McDonald White Paper would be released. This paper presented a unilateral policy which declared that Palestine would not become an independent state. The mandate would end in 1949. They would share the same government. Immigration would, and after accepting only 75,000 new immigrants from Jewish places over a 5-year period, land transfer and purchase would also be regulated. So you would have, sorry, I said 1930, I mean 1939. You would have this, now is coming to a head. They're trying to take away the immigration. They're trying to take away the unfair trade and acquisition of land. They're trying really to reach an equitable solution, to this problem. And they would put the whole area under the same government that would be governed internationally. So this is kind of the compromise they're looking at right now. But the full outbreak of war, again, big coincidence, in 1939 would lead to an international call for the refuge of the Jewish people. Again, as I talked about, that Mysterian Austrian painter who rose to prominence out of nowhere and all of a sudden became the most powerful and famous man of the 20th century, would turn international sentiment in favor of the Jewish people. So of the 75,000 immigrant permits at the time that were allowed, only 51K had been used. They couldn't even meet the quota. Not many people wanted, but due to these conditions in Europe, these restrictions were relaxed. And now they put in a new number of 18,000 per year that would be allowed to enter. And as you're going to see here in a moment, even that gets thrown away because these were legal immigrants. 20K plus estimated from April to December of 1943 had came in. So you're seeing basically they were getting the legal permits, but the Zionists had their own government infrastructure being built in place. They didn't care whether they were legal or illegal. They were getting them in and violating this British mandate system, which again is illegal. So what they started doing is putting more pressure on the British government. They claimed that the loss of life due to the deportation of illegal immigrants was going to be detrimental. Sound familiar? They say this to the West now. When you want to deport illegals, you want to deport criminals who come into your country and cause nothing but problems. Oh, you're the bad guy. And you see all the Zionist organizations doing the same thing. Same playbook, same people. They're doing it right here. In fact, they attacked the SS Patricia in Haifa Harbor. They sabotaged it, claimed basically that this would, again, put them at the lives of these people at risk. They had to do it, of course. So those illegal immigrants stayed along with countless other ones. And again, you're seeing now, God knows only how many illegals and legals combined. 18,000 was a new quota per year. And then you're seeing now, just in that short period of time, over 20,000. It's just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. And now something monumental happened in 1942. We would see the beginning of what we would call today the Mossad, covert Jewish terrorist activities. A gentleman by the name of Abraham Stern would emerge on the scene. This guy would launch series of political motivated murders. Like I told you, the next goal after they got the sentiment in Europe, get rid of the British. So he would start launching robberies, murders, sniper attacks in Tel Aviv area. They would raid British arms and munition from places all over the Middle East and distribute it into the area. Lord Moyne, the Minister of State in the Middle East, would be assassinated in Cairo by 2 members of this newly formed Stern gang. So you've got assassination of leaders. Do the Palestinians ever do that? You've got basically stealing British munitions, attacking British troops. We saw attacks earlier were blamed on the Palestinians, but nothing was conclusive. We're going to get into that later here in the next few minutes and show how we know those sniper attacks were not done by Arab Palestinians. They were done by these exact characters here. Because in July of 1946, you had the infamous King David Hotel bombing, where 86 public servants would be killed. This building is key because it was the location of the central offices of the Mandatory British Authority. It was the headquarters of the British Armed Forces. So it's a huge, huge building. They disregard what they did here. They disguised themselves as Arab laborers and waiters. They got beards. They dressed like me here today. They walked in there. and they planted bombs in the basement. Sound familiar? This has been a playbook of theirs. In fact, if you guys, any of you watched my Zionist presentation I did back in October of last year, right when this modern crisis started, I talked about several of these attacks. They did the exact same thing. They've done it countless times throughout history. They've done it recently, as just a few months ago. They've done it 20 years ago. It's just nonstop. So basically, disguising themselves as Arab, placing bombs, in the basement. Their main aim here was to destroy documents. And what do those documents say? They would incriminate the Zionists for attacks against the British. So there was investigations. The British were finding out who did this, who were doing these attacks over the last 4 to 5 years. They had done investigations. They had the paper trail. They had the evidences. These guys took that out, and they killed 86 people. Big international incident. So what this would do was, again, turn the tables back to Britain, either to get frustrated and give up or try to respond. Following the attack, our good friend Minister Winston Churchill, the former prime minister at this time, would still be sympathetic to the Zionists and call for eases on immigration. The British government knew who did these attacks. They were aware who did these attacks. And what do you have the former prime minister stating? He's still sympathetic to the causes of Zionism. Nothing has changed. This is treason. They attacked the mandated authority in this British-controlled territory, attacked British in uniform. They should have been tried for treason. Obviously, none of that happened, and the game moved on. Now, before that, you had something very key that was going on behind the scenes. So as the Zionists are working to get Britain out, they're also doing something a few short years before. They were furthering the alliance with the world's new superpower, the United States of America. 1942, they would have a meeting in New York made public. It was known as the Biltmore Program. The program would declare the conference aims its unilateral rejection of the white paper. That was the white paper I talked about, which banned the immigration, reduced it, then eventually eliminated it, stopped the land transactions, and they denied the moral or legal validity of it. The white paper seeks to limit and, in fact, nullify Jewish rights to immigration and settlement in Palestine. And as stated by Mr. Winston Churchill in the House of Commons, constitutes a breach and repudiation of the Balfour Declaration. So here you have now America jumping in, condemning the white paper. All the white paper asked was, don't steal land. You can't overwhelm the local population. The white paper wasn't asking for what we would consider to be crimes or atrocities, and yet these people openly condemned it. The conference urged, as they called it, the gates of Palestine must be opened, and that the Jewish agency would be appointed to have control over the immigration policy. Let's just give the keys to the prison to the prisoners. You can imagine the audacity of this, to allow this type of one biased authority to have complete sovereign control. And they wanted them to be controlled not just of that, but of building the country, including development of unoccupied and uncultivated lands, and it must be established as a Jewish commonwealth integrated in the structure of the democratic world. So now you're seeing the United States is saying what's going to happen a few short years later. They are going to be a recognized state in the world. In 1945, the Jewish Agency would present demands to the British government. Now they had America, they had some muscle, behind them. These were the demands. An immediate decision to be announced to establish Palestine as a Jewish state, now or else. That the Jewish Agency be invested with all necessary authority to bring to Palestine as many Jews as it finds necessary to settle and to develop fully and speedily, and the resources necessary for this. So not only that, the Jewish Agency, again, what the American paper said, what that conference came up with, you see it again here, that an international loan and other help be given for the transfer of the first 1 million Jews to Palestine and for the economic development of the country. So they're looking for loans. Well, they would extort Germany shortly after they would solve this problem. Germany still to this day is paying untold amounts of money to the state of Israel, along with Holland, France. I have to go and get a list. It's a wide list of countries that are paying them annually in Holocaust reparations. And that's, again, a different topic for a different day. So they would get that provision also, of course, as well. And that's mentioned here. They were going to get the reparations here in the fourth point. Germany would pay them that. And the first installment would be for the resettlement of Jews. So that first German payment for the Holocaust would then go for the resettlement of Jews. But they actually weren't calling it the Holocaust at the time. It was more for, the treatment they felt. One more, the international facilities be provided for the exit and transit of all Jews who wish to settle. So they're demanding here again that there's international pipeline to be set up in all the various countries to speed this process up of moving them around, getting them onto the planes and getting them down there with all the travel money and everything that they need. President Truman called for the opening of the gates of Palestine to 100K of the homeless Jews in Europe. So again, you see the American statements, being made there. And of course, they rejected the independence of Palestine, and it was full speed ahead like never before. And that would ultimately lead to the British government having to convene and simply state they couldn't accept these recommendations. They needed to go further. They needed to get involved, more deeply in all these issues and really try to find a solution once and for all. And they convened a new conference from September of 1946 to February of 1947. And they had several key points here. Palestine would be a unitary state with a permanent Arab majority and would obtain its independence as such after the transition period of 2 to 3 years. So this would happen. This was their new solution. Within this state, Jews who had acquired Palestinian citizenship after 10 years of residence in the country would have full civil rights equal to other citizens of Palestine. Special safeguards would be provided to protect the religious and cultural rights of the Jewish community. Nothing wrong here. The Jewish community would be entitled to a number of seats in the legislative assembly proportionate to the number of Jewish citizens, so representative government, and they would never be allowed to have more than 1/3. So you're seeing, again, very equitable, very fair. All legislation concerning immigration and transfer of a land would require the consent of the Arabs in Palestine as expressed by a majority of the Arab members of the Legislative Assembly, and safeguards provided for the Jewish community would be alterable only with the consent of the majority of Jewish members of the Legislative Assembly. So you had, again, fairness across the board, total fairness, much more than the last white paper that happened in 1939 that we talked about. But of course, the Zionists would declare this a travesty, and they would come back more stern than ever. They demanded, again, Palestine would be established as a Jewish Commonwealth and integrated in the structure of the democratic world, that the gates of Palestine to be opened, and the Jewish Agency, again, would be vested with that control. So they were not backing down. They were going to get this. And again, Great Britain would relinquish the mandate over to the Palestinian problem in the mandate over to the control of the newly formed United Nations. So the era of the mandate now was finally over. Britain had relinquished it, given it the control of the United Nations. During this mandate period of 1920 here to 1947, we would see the population of Palestine go from 750,000 to 1,850,000. We would see the population basically of Jews rise from 84K in 1922 all the way to basically 608,000 in 1946. The population of Jews was now 1/3, and they would now take up to 12% of all irritable, cultivable, land. And it was the beginning of the end of things to come. As the British would become frustrated, they've handed it over. There's no more now authority. As I talked about a few minutes ago, getting Britain out of the way was now accomplished. And it was off to the races they went, because there was no authority figure who had a slight bit of conscience anymore to stand in their way. The United States was completely in their pocket, had given them the green light to do whatever they wanted. We're going to see that in part 3, just how quickly the United States accepted this new sovereign state of Israel. I mean, they've been talking about it for, a few years. They were ready, obviously, all the framework was in place, and dark days lied ahead. You know, the mandate period, as bad as it was, as illegal as it was not as bad as things were going to get, as we were going to see the land continue to shrink. We are going to see major wars coming over the next 20 to 30 years. And next part, we're going to look all the way up to the 1971 conflict. We're going to go from 48 all the way up.